Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Constangy's webinar, DEI Audits, Tools to Enhance Your DEI Practices. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Today's webinar is approved for SHRM and HRCI credit. We will provide these codes to you at the end of the presentation, so please stick around in order to get those. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please submit them through the chat function. You can access the chat through the toolbar located at the bottom of your screen. Cara and Lara will leave some time at the end to answer your questions. Lastly, we will be providing a copy of the PowerPoint used during today's webinar and a recording of the presentation. These materials will be sent to you once the recording has been uploaded by tomorrow afternoon. Today's presenters are Constangy partners Cara, Crotty, and Lara de Leon. Cara serves as chair of our Affirmative Action and OFCCP Compliance Practice Group and is located in our Columbia, South Carolina office. She advises employers on ways to avoid litigation and has defended employers in cases involving virtually every aspect of the employment relationship, including discrimination, harassment, and retaliation claims, and various other federal and state law claims. Cara also represents federal contractors covered by Executive Order 11246, Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act in their affirmative action compliance obligations by assisting with plan preparation, completion of EE01 and VETS 4212 reports, and defending compliance evaluations. She also prepares privileged compensation and pay equity analyses for organizations examining their pay practices. Lara is an experienced trial lawyer and client advocate, splitting her time between our San Antonio, Texas, and Orange County, California offices. She also serves as co-chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Practice Group. Her extensive career has involved representing companies of all sizes across many industries and all aspects of employment law. Lara has successfully defended clients in the courtroom, before administrative agencies, and on appeal. In addition to litigation, Lara has spent her extensive career partnering with clients to counsel them through complex issues involving discrimination, harassment, retaliation, accommodations, and wage and hour compliance. Lara is an accomplished speaker and presenter, having presented on cutting-edge employment law topics at local and national events, as well as many online forums. Lara is licensed to practice law in both California and Texas, and is board certified in labor and employment law by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization. I'm now going to turn it over to Cara and Lara.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome today. Thank you for joining us. We have a lot to cover on diversity, equity, and inclusion audits, so we're just going to go ahead and get started with the first burning question that we should probably be asking ourselves as we embark on this is, why perform a DE&I audit? The reasons for conducting an audit, and those of you who are participating are already here or are attending because you've already made this important decision, but just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the various reasons why we want to do so and how important it is to include audits as a key component to any DE&I strategy. It's not so much a question anymore of whether you should be doing an audit if you are trying to expand out or develop a DE&I strategy. But the question is really, how are you going to do it? And really, how often are you going to do it? Not to mention, what are you going to do with the results of it? There was a recent article by Forbes that emphasized DE&I pitfalls in basic organizations and showed that lacking a strategic plan was one of the biggest pitfalls of organizations' DE&I strategies. And as part of that strategic plan, it included two key things that involved DE&I audits. One was having key performance indicators with respect to your DE&I strategy, having metrics, and a way to hold management accountable to achieving those KPIs. Both of those key components, of course, involve quantifying or analyzing your workforce. So hence we are talking about audits, and in particular, how they really can influence and drive some of your bigger DE&I strategies. We're seeing increased movement by a number of organizations in terms of disclosing their DE&I data. You know, a number of years ago, it was almost taboo. There was a lot of fear out there about disclosing this data, worried about it would put a target on your backs. In this day and age, transparency is really the key. that we're seeing, the messages that we're receiving from third parties, from employees, and from within organizations. So more and more, we're seeing companies not just peek under the hood and look at their data and see how they can make things better, but also publicizing those numbers. Even as little as 2 years ago in terms of the data that was being collected, less than half of the S&P 100 companies were disclosing their EEO-1 reports, which are, as you know, are pretty basic governmentally required reports that need to be submitted every year. Now, as of the most recent data that we saw last year, 94% of the S&P 100 companies have either disclosed publicly their EEO-1 reports or have publicly committed to doing so. So, again, we're definitely seeing this trend towards disclosure. Now, one little note that we should say is that, the EEO-1 report, of course, is a step in the right direction, but the report itself really shouldn't be a substitute for a more robust analysis of the organization's either representation or other aspects involving their DE&I practice. It's a good part of the process, again, but it is absolutely not the end state, and again, we're actually seeing organizations being more comfortable with going a little bit further in terms of the data that they might be making available to broader audiences. From one study that looked at the Russell 1000 companies, and the Russell 1000 companies, it's an organization that looks at the top 1,000 stocks in the Russell 3000 index. So these organizations account for the vast majority of market capital that this group looks at. But from what we're seeing from the more recent data that they've collected, about 55% of those organizations are disclosing some element of their organizational racial makeup. The 11% you can kind of see in that dark blue are those that are actually providing EEO-1 or even more detailed intersectional data. The 24% shows more detailed race and ethnicity data, and so that would be data that shows representation numbers by the different races, so white, Hispanic, Black, 2 or more, Asian Pacific Islander, for example. And then the final 20% just shows the data in terms of white or non-white employees. So those are very big aggregate buckets, but again, I would at least suggest that is something, and that is a lot more than what we have historically seen from a lot of organizations. We're still seeing shareholder pressure or requests from advocacy organizations to publicly traded companies to actually release EEO-1 reports or release other diversity data. It is a driving force for, I think, a lot of these decisions by organizations, and shareholders really do want to continue to see not just initial point in time transparency, but then of course progress over time. And that is an issue of concern with some organizations, when they're thinking about disclosing their data. It's one thing to give that point in time data, but if you continue that practice year over year, the concern is that you're going to be subject to some scrutiny, and the questions are going to be asked, well, why haven't you made as much progress in this area? That's exactly the type of thing that transparency is designed to achieve. So, one would say that should not be a point of concern, but it should actually be a motivation for disclosing this, because you can be accountable now, not just to yourselves, but to your shareholders and others who might be reviewing that data. We are also seeing just an increase in state law requirements with respect to disclosure or reporting of certain diversity data. 2 states right now, California and Illinois, each require organizations to conduct analyses and publish or present that data to the state agencies. In Illinois, this came out last year, but is effective January 1st of this year. It's called SB 148, but effective January 1, companies that are organized under Illinois law or those that are authorized to do business in Illinois that file EEO-1 reports, they are required to submit that data to the state. They're required to actually have their demographic data be verified as accurate by an officer of the organization. And the state is going to publish that demographic information. The statute also requires employers to conduct a pay equity analysis and provide data relating to how those employees are paid according to job structure and their demographic information. Now, the state isn't going to publish pay information, just the demographic information, but still it is an important step for those employers that they need to provide that pay information to the state. Similarly, in California doesn't publish the demographic data that is reported to it, but we continue to see the state sort of up the ante in terms of the pay data reporting that they are requiring employers to do every year. And this year we did see a number of significant changes, all designed to eliminate the pay gap, not just with women, but also individuals of color. And so those of you who even have a single employee out in California, you are somewhat familiar with these pay data reports, but you need to, you're going to be required to provide reports that analyze or provide data regarding pay, mean pay, according to different job groups and according to the different demographic levels. And this year is different because the state has added a new component where you don't just have to report on your own workforce, but if you obtain more than 100 employees from a labor contractor, like a temp agency or something, you also have to do a pay data report on those labor contractors that you get. So again, just this complete movement that we're seeing by a number of bellwether states driving more transparency and more accountability to organizations to ensure that they are looking at this basic information. We still don't really know what they're going to do with the information. So far, they've, at least in California, they've just addressed issues of non-compliance with employers, those who haven't actually submitted their reports, but we're still not 100% sure about what they're going to do with this data. But still, we see the drive forward towards more internal regulation, internal looking, and accountability to organizations for doing that. So shifting to another aspect of why should we be doing these sorts of audits. Doing these audits is a very significant component of how you can demonstrate an investment in DE&I. As I mentioned, it's not the be-all end state. You don't get a gold star just for doing a DE&I audit. It should be a means to an end in order to drive change in your organization and drive accountability in your organization. But now when Glassdoor has looked into this issue of how do job applicants see and value diversity efforts when considering a new job. And what's really interesting is that we're seeing DE&I investment being a significant factor for the younger workforce. 74% of employees and job seekers aged 35 to 54 say that equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion is very or somewhat important to them when they're considering a new job. And then you can see also among those aged 35 to 54, sorry, I messed up there, 18 to 34, 80% said that that is very important to them or somewhat important to them. Job seekers and employees aged 35 to 54, 74% of them say it's very important or somewhat important. And then you can see the other two there, 67% and 61%. So even across all ages, we're seeing that investment in DE&I. More than half of your employees and your job seekers care about that, and they're going to be looking at that. Another interesting little thing that the Glassdoor report showed is that Black employees overall are more likely to say that corporate investment in DE&I is very or somewhat important to them when considering a new job, with older Black employees having the highest share, 84%, who said that DE&I was very or somewhat important to them. And for those of you who are interested, that is from November 2022 Glassdoor study. A similar study, or a kind of an initial study done from Glassdoor back in September of 2020, showed similar results, but I think we're just seeing that more magnified now as time goes on. With overall, just 2 years ago, 76% of employees and job seekers said that diverse workforce was important to them for evaluating job offers. We see that that has now sort of gone up. Almost half of Black and Hispanic employees together and job seekers say that they have actually quit a job after witnessing or experiencing discrimination at work. And 37% of employees and job seekers say they won't apply to a company that has a negative satisfaction rating among people of color. There are some online forums out there that address diversity and the workplace impressions among people of color. And we highlighted this before when we did this presentation last year. Dipper is actually still out there. It is an online community for people of color to comment, review, and discuss their workplace experiences. You do have to sign up to have access to that content. It still is, however, probably one of the more public-facing communities that we know of where folks are talking, and they're talking about this very important issue to them. There are a number of other outlets as well where folks talk. So we just know that employees talk, applicants talk about jobs. So it's just yet another source of information, that we need to be mindful of when we're assessing our DE&I efforts. ESG investing is still going strong. The environmental, social, and governance sort of trifecta of evaluations of organizations and determining how to, or which organizations do we invest in. And of course, the social piece of the pie does reflect on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. We're seeing a lot of activity now too with M&A, merger and acquisition in different companies, and seeing the DE&I efforts, the evaluation of the organization, the steps that you're undertaking as an organization are becoming part of the due diligence. And it's becoming important and information that does need to be shared, and things that are considered in terms of that. If those of you have gone through an M&A transaction, they not only look at compliance issues, have you done your AAPs, or what do your EEO1 statements look like, but also want to see aspects of a broader DE&I culture, such as discrimination and harassment complaints. What sort of mechanism do you have in your organization to address those complaints? What is your DE&I strategy? And do you have employee resource groups, and how do they function? Other non-quantitative evaluators of a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy are things that are being evaluated and are of interest when considering mergers and acquisitions. So just to sort of round out some of the things that we look at, and we are going to get into a lot more detail on how do we do all this, right? What are some of the things we need to look at? And Cara's going to take you through that in just a bit. But I do want to talk a second about disparities in advancement, because it is one thing to look at our data as it is a picture in time, and to say, oh, well, we have X percent from this group, or X percent from this gender, and look at it as a stagnant picture. But it's very important on how we look at that data and to see what does it tell us about the lifespan or life cycle of an employee in our organization. And what we're seeing is that a comparison of entry-level positions versus executive positions we are seeing that entry-level positions tend to be more diverse or have more representation of employees who are non-white than our executive positions. Now, some of you are going to say, Lara, I know that, that's nothing new. And you're right, that has been an issue that we have seen for a while, but now that we have data and we have more and more data and employers are actually looking at this information, it really is going to become incumbent on organizations to look at what are we doing and how are we helping to move that needle and ensure that we have better representation up in the higher levels of the organization. A closer look at this information, it's one thing just to look at entry level versus executive. This was a Mercer study that was done in 2022, which actually dove a little bit deeper into the racial makeup of employees at certain levels in the organization. We talked before about, the white versus non-white or, different layers that you can look at. This actually looked at some of the layers and while we see that the majority of these managers, senior managers and executives are white employees, we can see sort of the breakdown amongst the other races. Now, an interesting thing is that this Mercer study was actually largely about diversity involving Black employees and their representation in the workplace. But it was interesting of them really to look at the other races as well. And so what we see is, it absolutely continues to lag against white employees. And so having access to this data can help us look internally too at ourselves and say, what can we do better or what do we need to do in order to make these, this bar chart look a little bit differently. So we always like to caution about the flip side of DEI for a second. We want to make sure that we don't overcorrect. And what we mean with that is that there is still a double-edged sword in this country when it comes to diversity issues. And that double-edged sword are anti-discrimination laws, because our anti-discrimination laws talk about not discriminating on the basis of race, which includes not discriminating against white employees or employees who might be in the majority in your workplace. There's always been this healthy tension, or maybe a not so healthy tension with our employment discrimination laws and our compliance laws here that say, hey, on the one hand, you need to make efforts and you need to show good faith efforts to improve diversity, or you need to not discriminate against the racial minorities on the one hand, but on the other hand, we can't go too far and have quotas or take as aggressive action as some might want to take, because that could have a reverse discrimination impact on others. And that is just the tension, right, that exists. And that is part of the reason why, this area is so interesting and evolving. It's almost like seeing, how far can we push the envelope? It's just really exciting to see how we can do that and make an effort and make gains, but also still not come up against these employment discrimination laws. But what we're seeing, though, unfortunately, in a couple of places, we're starting to see more cases involving claims of reverse discrimination, where claims are brought usually by a white employee, someone who's in the racial majority, bring a claim for employment discrimination, saying that they were terminated or denied a promotion all in the face of diversity. And it is a situation that we must be cognizant of. There was one case in North Carolina back in 2021 where a white employee got a $10 million jury verdict based on his claims that he was discriminated against because he was a white male. And part of the evidence that he used to present his case that he was being discriminated against, that the jury actually found to be quite persuasive, was they used some of the organization's diversity and inclusion efforts against them. It showed that the organization, statements were made by the D&I officer at the time where they were trying to use diversity as a lens for its employment decision-making, that the long-term incentive plan for senior leadership members who could demonstrate that they actually improve the diversity and inclusion in their organization increased. So with some of that information, again, the jury was convinced that this individual was terminated in an effort to make way for diverse and or female talent. We don't want this to scare people off by any stretch of the imagination, but it just needs to be a healthy dose of reality that this is the environment, that a lot of employers operate in. So we need to be careful not to swing too far to the other guardrail and our zealousness to improve these efforts. There is another case that involved a similar situation where a plaintiff who was a white male, he was an assistant purchasing agent and the purchasing agent job came available and he didn't get it. And he claims he didn't get it because of the city's desire to promote diversity sort of at all costs. And there were two things that sort of hit against this company. And I think we can file this, or hit against the city employer. We can file this, away and say, we just need to make sure that we don't repeat these issues. But one of them was that the mayor had actually come out and used the hiring of the diverse individual. He was holding that up as an accolade about how he was bringing diversity to the city. And then the other issue that kind of sunk the employer in this particular case was the diverse individual who they ultimately hired into this purchasing agent position. They found out that he actually never submitted an application until after they decided to hire him. So all that threw suspicion right on the employer. Now, there are things that we can do as employers, to ensure that that doesn't happen to us, right? Ensure that we have policies of transparency and ensure that all applicants have to follow the same steps in order to be considered for a job. But it's just to say, there were some missteps, but it also shows the kind of little things that a court or jury are going to look at, as they are kind of eyeing these diversity issues with a suspicious eye. So just be mindful about those things. We don't want to swing too far, to the other direction and sort of abandon, our knowledge and awareness of the legal environment that we're operating in. So if I haven't convinced you to do a DEI audit yet, I don't know what else I can do. But we know that here are some really good points to support doing a DE&I audit. And for those of you who might be in organizations that are still lagging or organizations that might need a little bit more encouragement to do more, maybe than what you're doing, here are some good points for you to consider. Doing an audit helps you have a starting point and a benchmark. It is a quantitative way to evaluate your current status as well as evaluate your progress through those. Business leaders like data. This is a very good, good starting point or benchmark to have that you can use as one of your many tools to assess your organization. If you're not doing an audit, you are also potentially not in compliance with your legal obligations. Those of you who are governmental contractors or employers who have more than 100 employees, you need to be doing your annual, at least at a minimum, your EEO1s, your affirmative action plans. And then again, if you are employers in Illinois and California, and there are a couple of other states too that are not as prominent or have as much onerous requirements as Illinois and California, you need to be doing these audits, or you risk not just, the wrath of, the public and not having, taking a look under your hood and seeing what your organization is like, but you're going to be not compliant. You could be subject to fines and penalties as well. Without an audit, it's hard to ensure satisfaction of employees and investors. Again, there are many different ways to look at this, and you need to be able to show a return on investment for your diversity and your DE&I efforts, right? This is an easy quantitative look at how are our efforts resulting? Are they showing us the results that we want? Are they actually increasing employee satisfaction? Are they increasing our inclusivity ratings? Are they increasing the diversity in our organization? So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Cara, who is going to spend the rest of our time talking more about what to consider before doing a DE&I audit.
Thanks, Laura. And now that Laura's definitely convinced everyone that they should and need to be doing that, we'll talk a little bit more about some things to consider and some nuts and bolts about doing a DEI audit. So there are many things to think about before you get started. So we'll cover the ones that are kind of foremost in my mind. And you know, as litigators, discoverability is certainly one of the things that we think about first. It's definitely something that should be considered by any employer, because DEI analyses and reports may potentially be subject to discovery in litigation. And you know, generally speaking, the bar for what is discoverable is pretty low. So absent some type of privilege or you know, a valid objection based on scope or relevancy, the information that you gather during the audit, as well as the analyses you do and the conclusions, could potentially be discoverable and end up in the hands of an opposing party. So we always want to do as much as we can to ensure that the audit will be protected by the attorney-client privilege, but obviously that's always going to be up to a court to, at the end of the day, determine whether the privilege applies. So just make sure you understand that despite your best efforts, it could potentially be discoverable. And we'll talk in a minute about involving counsel in the process to help ensure that the privilege will apply. But I don't think I'm really of the opinion that the potential or possibility of discoverability itself should keep an employer from conducting a DEI audit. I think the benefits of doing an audit generally outweigh the potential downsides. It certainly will help you address compliance shortcomings, like Laura mentioned, that you might not otherwise discover or be aware of. In my mind, the biggest downside to the information being disclosed would be when there are the results or the conclusion of the audit have recommendations around compliance that aren't considered or addressed, because that could demonstrate that the company knowingly was violating the law and failed to correct a known, like an equity problem. So depending on the lawsuit and the laws involved, that could potentially result in higher damages. Another important item to consider is the type of information that you have or will need for the DEI audit that you want to perform. For example, think about areas where you might be missing information. I can think of things like sexual orientation and gender identity, national origin. Those are pieces of information that are not traditionally collected by employers. So if that's an area that you want to look in, you might need to conduct or consider conducting some surveys of your workforce. If you do that, you want to make sure that your surveys are voluntary and that you're communicating with your employees about the reason you're collecting the information, how it will be used, and certainly that it will only be used in the aggregate. You're not going to, make individually identifiable information available. If you don't possess information on your employees that you want to analyze or evaluate, again, you might want to do that survey, but you first want to make sure that there's a legitimate and lawful way to obtain that information. Typically in the US, there is no issue with requesting that type of information from your employees as long as you're doing it on a voluntary basis. But be aware of state-specific laws, like privacy laws or other limitations on your ability to ask or obtain that information. And certainly many countries outside of the US do prohibit some of those types of inquiries. So look into that before proceeding with that type of survey in any foreign countries. You also want to make sure the data that you do have is reliable and accurate. HRIS, Human Resources Information Systems, applicant tracking systems are often not as, I try to put this diplomatically, are not as robust or good at accurately capturing information that we need for analyzing different types of employment activity or data that we have. And I would say promotions sticks out in my mind as one area where I routinely see really poor data management, that a promotion occurred or that a job change of any type occurred or what type of movement it was. There seems to be difficulty in tracking that information. And sometimes it's the HRIS, or sometimes it's just not the organization doesn't have a consistent way of recording the information. But using data that lacks reliability is going to result in information that has no use, right? It's not going to be meaningful for the organization. So you may need to invest some time on the front end in researching the data that you have and cleaning it up to make sure it's accurate and reliable. And I wouldn't automatically assume that the information coming out of your system is correct. So it's important to spend some time and verify that information. It's also important to consider and develop the purpose of your audit. So when we're doing audits around compliance with legal requirements, it's really easy to do that, right? Because we're looking at a specific standard, an objective standard, to determine whether or not we are meeting that or complying with that. When we're talking about an objective like this, where we're evaluating aspirational goals or other things that are not technically or legally required, the process or what exactly we want to look at, is a little bit more, potentially difficult to get our arms around. And this could be different for different organizations. They'll have different things that they're hoping to get out of their audit. So this is one of the things I recommend that you look at when you're starting this process and have the team that's involved in doing the audit, confer and map out what is it that we're hoping this audit will achieve for our organization. And then once you have those objectives, I think it's okay for, the best approach would then be to draw your roadmap for how to get there. And so there are different things that you might hope to achieve in your audit. Things like EEO compliance or, pay equity. Laura's talking about the different state laws that are require pay reporting now, and the importance of knowing what your organization looks like, measuring your workforce demographics, and determining whether or not goals might be appropriate. All of those types of things are types of information or types of the goals that you might want to be achieving in your audit. And of course, there are different types of audits to perform. The three that come to my mind are the quantitative analyses, and then qualitative assessments and engagement surveys or evaluations. So when we talk about quantitative analysis, this is the numbers, and as a representative of federal contractors developing affirmative action plans all the time, I really like this piece, even though if you told me I'd be doing a lot of math in my career, I never would have believed you, but be that as it may. The quantitative analyses are where we're measuring and doing data analytics and looking at results around our recruitment and selection processes, are evaluating our compensation, evaluating our employment activity to look for differences, different rates of selections for different groups. So we're looking for potential adverse impact and concerns based on our numbers in different areas. when we're talking about qualitative assessments, for some reason, the word that comes to my mind is this is kind of softer. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but here we're talking more about our internal DEI efforts, our compliance objectives. This is not data driven. We're not going to be crunching numbers when we do our qualitative review. We're going to be looking at whether or not we have any compliance issues on the EEO side of things, what our DEI initiatives are, what our policies are, and where we might need to make changes. Same for our culture, our internal culture, and what type of achievements we've made in the DEI space. And then engagement, I think, involves more of how have our DEI efforts affected or influenced our different constituents, and what additional work do we need to do as a result of what that audit shows. So what information are we going to need for doing a DEI audit? Well, that obviously is going to depend on what your goal is and type of audit that you're conducting. But some basic examples that I think would be helpful to consider include your policies and procedures. This is probably going to be at the top of your list. And I came up with a lengthy list of the types of policies and procedures that you might consider reviewing. Obviously, your EEO and DEI policies, harassment, retaliation, those are pretty obvious. But also consider your reasonable accommodation policies, and not just for disability, but also for religion. Do we have policies and procedures in place for making reasonable accommodations? Your overall handbook should be reviewed from a DEI lens. Do you have a policy that addresses your selection process? A lot of times I'll be talking with clients about their selection process and what the procedure is, and there's no written document that describes what the selection process is. Policies on your recruitment and interviewing. How do we conduct interviews? Your self-ID process. Gathering your demographic information from your employees and applicants if you're a federal contractor. Your compensation policies, and not necessarily just how we set compensation, but how it is adjusted over time, as well as all the different components of pay. How do we determine bonuses and incentives and who gets overtime? So potentially diving deeper than just how compensation is set when someone joins the organization. Policies around using facilities or other policies that could impact your transgender employees, including benefits. Leave policy and flexible workplace policies are important. So anything, I think, involving grooming or dress code. I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal, it may have been just yesterday, about airlines who very traditionally have been very traditional in their uniform policy since the beginning of the industry's existence. Many of them are now just adopting either like a unisex gender, a uniform policy, or allowing employees to wear whatever uniforms they want. So it was kind of an interesting take on a very traditional industry. Think about your ERGs, employee resource groups, if you have them, policies on that, making sure we have all our required posters up in all of our workplaces, as well as digitally on our intranet. So really anything that's impacting EEO and DEI in your organization, you want to pull in at this part of the audit. So you want to make sure you're reviewing and assessing your policies, not just for compliance, but are they going far enough? I mean, that's really the other part of the DEI audit. Are there ways that we can be more progressive and expand going beyond just the minimum of compliance? So look for gaps. Obviously, if there's something missing, we want to, from a legal standpoint, we want to fill that. But are there any policies that we don't have that we might want to implement? Employee surveys can also provide useful information for a DEI audit. So, you may need to have a better understanding of what your employee perceptions are. Laura was talking about those surveys from Glassdoor, from employees and their perspective, and the other online communities where individuals talk about their workplace. I suspect a lot of employers would be surprised to see what some of their workers are saying online. So if you haven't conducted an employee survey in a while, it might be a good idea to take the time to gauge their view of the workplace and the organization. And so depending on how in-depth or detailed you want to get in your survey, it might be advisable to engage an industrial psychologist or other consultant to help design it. But generally, the queries that you ask should be designed to measure things like, is this a good company to work for? How long do you plan on staying here? Would you recommend this company to your friends and family? Do you feel a sense of belonging and that the workplace is welcoming? Do you feel we're doing enough to promote DEI? Those types of areas. And when you're doing a survey for this purpose, I think you'd want to leave the questions open-ended, at least provide the opportunity for comments to allow you to see if themes develop in the responses that can help you focus on one area or another. So employee surveys can definitely be a helpful tool to determine whether and where changes can be made. But I would say, don't do a survey unless you're willing to heed what you're being told by your workers, because they are mindful when they provide feedback and then they never see, hear anything or see a response from the organization. And I don't think that means you need to adopt every suggestion that's made or react to every comment, but there should be some result or output to kind of to tie the loop for your employees that participated. Data, my favorite. Data is obviously a very important part of a quantitative DEI audit. So here's a list of the types of information that you may need to include. Your workforce demographics is usually a good starting point. What is the racial and gender makeup of your workforce? You might be looking at other type of demographics such as age or national origin. And then once you have that, a good idea is to compare it to what's the availability and the census data show. How close is our representation to what we would reasonably expect it to be based on the census information. And the census can provide fairly detailed information on population statistics based on race and gender in certain different geographic areas and by occupation. So it's definitely a useful tool. Look at your applicants and does the flow of your applicants and the demographics match what you would expect based on that census information? If you're not close to hitting the mark, then you might want to consider more targeted recruitment, for example. Your hires. Here's where we would want to potentially evaluate the selection rates of the different demographic groups to ensure that there isn't a component of your process that's having an adverse impact on the basis of a protected characteristics. For example, are you using a test in the selection process? Those can often have an adverse impact. And if you're not analyzing and looking for that, it's something that could slip by you. Promotions are, this will allow you to look at the rates that employees are progressing upward through the organization, and to see if females and people of color are advancing at the rate you would expect they would be. Kind of back to that slide where Laura showed the difference in the demographics of our different levels of management. You can look to see where is our representation of females and minorities dropping off, and what might be the cause of that. Retention is equally important. Are your females or people of color leaving the organization at a disproportionately high rate? And if so, what's the cause of that? Do we have exit interviews that might give us some insight? Compensation, pay equity is such a hot topic right now. It's a huge focus for both federal and state agencies, as well as plaintiffs' attorneys. It's probably anecdotal, but I think I'm seeing more kind of an uptick in pay equity cases being filed recently. And Laura touched on the state laws where or the states where we're required to report on pay data. It's very likely that the EEOC will revive the EEO1 component 2, where we had, remember a couple of years ago, we had the privilege of reporting on compensation data for our organizations. They have the results of the National Academy's study that was done. And I think once we have 3 Democrat commissioners in place, it's more than likely going to come back. Leadership and leadership development, succession plans. How is the organization planning for the future? What's consideration being given to developing diverse members of management? All of these types of things are important. If you're using AI software, make sure you're evaluating that to see what type of impact it's having, and that not creating an adverse impact. New York City's leading the charge on this. They're the most progressive, and there's a law that is going into effect this year that will require employers in the city to report information and disclose information about their AI used in the selection process. So there's a lot of data available that you will want to take advantage of. And there's other information that could be helpful in a DEI audit as well. It's kind of beyond the data side of things. So this is more on the qualitative type of audit. I think you can slip to the next slide, Laura. So communications, your internal and external communications. Are we promoting DE and I and our equal employment opportunity policies and practices? EEO complaints. Are there trends that are occurring that we need to address? If you're not looking at it in a holistic fashion and just taking them one at a time, reviewing them one at a time, if no one's kind of looking at it from a global perspective, some of those trends could be missed. Employee resource groups, do you have them? If not, is there an appetite to create them? Cultural activities, what types of events does the organization promote and celebrate in the workplace? There are all kinds of opportunities to do that. Hispanic Heritage Month, Disability Awareness Month. There's so many that an employer can use to show its commitment to its diverse workforce. Other community events. Is the organization involved in different community organizations that help support racial or social justice initiatives, making sure that you're touting and not just touting it, but that you're committed to those types of organizations, and it's an important part of the company's culture. Educational opportunities. Do you support employees in furthering their education, either through providing tuition reimbursement or providing time off? Are we educating our employees on DEI policies? Making accommodations, providing flexible work arrangements. All of those are the types of things that can help an organization achieve and maintain a diverse workforce. So looking at that is definitely important. Who should conduct the DEI audit for your organization? Well, obviously the two likely options are either doing it internally or externally. So just a note here, it can be privileged either way. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to claim privileged when only in-house counsel are involved, but it's certainly not the end of the, end of the equation. You want to make sure, regardless of whether it's being done by inside counsel or outside counsel, that the purpose of the audit is to obtain legal advice, not just focusing on business aspects. or issues for the company. It might cost more if you're using an outside consultant or resource to do it, but you might not have the internal resources that could spend the time and devote the time, on top of their everyday job to do these types of tasks. So to keep that in mind when you're looking at the resources available. And when we're talking about privilege, also remember that what we want to be privileged are the results of the audit and the information we looked at, but your data, your underlying information and policies, data itself exists, and that's typically not going to be considered privileged anyway. Also remember that doing a DEI audit is not just for HR, it's not just for your DE&I team. A thorough audit is going to involve input from a wide variety of sources in the organization. And so really any department or team that has a role in impacting the terms and conditions of employment should be involved. So just make sure you have the buy-in and cooperation of everyone that you might need before undertaking the audit. We've got a few minutes left, so we'll wrap up here. Utilizing the results of your audit. So after the audit is complete, you want to make sure that you develop your strategic DEI plan. So I call this is your roadmap. And so these are the basic steps that I came up with, but you might have some additional stops along the way to add. But I always recommend that you start with compliance. So compliance is your number one priority. So if there are areas where the organization's not in compliance with the law, you need to address that first to limit potential liability. And then if you find barriers to EEO or advancing diversity, figure out how you can reduce or eliminate them, such as revising accommodation policies or eliminating or unnecessary or outdated job qualification standards. You want to update your policies where needed or implement new policies where you can be more progressive than the law requires you to be, in maybe areas of transparency or, again, policies like you might be in a jurisdiction that does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of natural hairstyles, the Crown Acts, but you could go ahead and adopt that type of policy anyway. You might find that there are areas where you can provide additional training, again, where it might not be legally required, but you could offer training that does help further your DE&I initiatives like unconscious bias training. And then further data analytics. Have you performed all the analyses that you want to, that you need to? Is there additional information that you should be tracking? There's a lot of emphasis lately on setting diversity goals, especially for females and people of color. So I generally recommend that you don't want to set goals unless you have a reasonable basis for doing that. And that, of course, means you've analyzed your workforce and have compared your demographics to the availability data. And generally goals are not necessary unless you're way off the mark of where you would reasonably expect to be. You shouldn't necessarily expect your representation to exactly match the availability, for example. And if you do set goals, your data, the availability data will set the basis for determining what the appropriate goal should be. So we're not pulling a number out of the air, we're basing it on some objective criteria. And that should be a placement goal that looks at new placements into the job over time. You want to make sure that your CEOs and other executives are well-versed in what it means to have a goal. As Laura mentioned in the example with the city, the mayor's comments can be used as evidence. And we want to make sure that whatever they're saying, what our executives, how they deliver this message, doesn't appear that we have quotas or that we're setting we're setting goals that aren't reasonably attainable. There are also questions about whether or not to publicize. As Laura showed at the beginning, more and more employers are doing that. It depends on what the information is. So this is a business decision that every organization has to make for itself, and it really depends on how transparent you want to be. And there are lots of factors that you have to take into account, including your shareholders and your employees and customers and so forth. You know, a lot of employers are releasing their EEO-1 report information. I think that's mostly the larger public employers that are kind of doing it as a matter of course now. But you may have heard in the news last year when the OFCCP announced that it would be releasing the EEO-1 reports for federal contractors unless they objected. In response to a Freedom of Information Act request. And I know many contractors were concerned about that and did file objections. So we don't know yet how many contractors objected. The OFCCP hasn't provided information on that, but it definitely will be interesting if they do to see what percentage or how many contractors objected. A quick note on the NLRA: if you are publishing information to a subset or a portion of your workforce and don't want or expect them to talk about it or post it on social media, just be aware that generally employees have the right to share that information with coworkers and third parties, and even a request that they keep information confidential could potentially be considered a restraint on their rights to engage in protected concerted activity. So just be cautious if you're kind of providing it piecemeal, and talk to a labor lawyer if you're worried about those issues. I know we're at the top of the hour, so just to wrap up, diversity theater, something we want to avoid. I'd recommend this article in Wired. I think it's available online, but it just talked about the disconnect between companies that tout their diversity efforts, but then really aren't doing what they're saying they're doing, or aren't treating their employees as they profess that they are. So just be aware that this exists, and your employees are certainly can recognize when there's a disconnect between your PR statements and what's happening internally. And then we'll close very briefly, since we're talking about DEI audits, just to let you know, Constangy does have a few DEI audit services and tools that you could be interested in. There's information on our website, so please feel free to check it out. If you'd like a demo, let me know. These tend to focus really more, at least the ones indicated here, on the qualitative side of doing a DEI audit. So we've got checklists and questionnaires that you can use to kind of walk through a lot of the different components that we talked about. So Laura, I have not been monitoring the chat, but if we've got questions, then we can take those. And there's the SHRM information.
Great, thanks, Cara. I don't know if we have time to address the questions as we go, or since we are at the top of the hour, and certainly don't want people to feel like they have to stay for that. But just note, here are the SHRM activity codes and the HRCI activity ID, so you can certainly claim your credit. I think we could probably go through the questions for those who want to stay on. I'll defer to our moderator to let us know what to do at this point.
Yes, please feel free to go through the questions if you wish.
Okay, sure. Great. Glad to. We will absolutely share the slides. That was a question. Yes, you will receive a copy of the presentation. Oh, sorry, those were answered. Question from earlier on, are you measuring against the overall population in the US of each race? Also, all these stats are US. So from the first half, yes, the statistics that I was referring to, those were largely US studies, and sort of what I've found is that US, we are a little bit more unique than other countries in terms of our tracking and collecting employee racial data. Outside the US, there's such a hodgepodge of laws and privacy issues. I found it sort of hard or incomplete if you want to get like a global look on it. So yeah, so what we've been talking about, at least the first half, has been US-based information. And then, when we look about measurement, Cara mentioned the census data, which even though it's 10 years old, it still is sort of the best indicator. You probably the more a lot.
It's newer now. It's not quite that. They updated it.
They did. Okay. Well, usually so it's like every 10 years.
It's not 2022.
Okay. Thank you for that correction.
Yeah, I mean,
no dissing on the Census Bureau here. But that is the best. More kind of considered more reliable data that talks about job availability. And it's a little bit more than just the US population by race. Sometimes it can be a little bit more fine-tuned to availability by geographic area, or even, particular, job opportunity availability. So it does kind of can be drilled down a little bit more to give you, a better comparison point. I would imagine that some, other organizations or consultants might have a feel into different, other data. The main thing is that if you're looking at something as a benchmark, you want to make sure that that in itself is accurate and reliable. Otherwise, you're sort of basing your benchmarks or your, I'll say goals, for lack of a better word, on faulty data itself, right? So you want to make sure that you've got a firm foundation on what your comparison data is going to be when you do these. So I think that another question was giving an example of metrics for DE&I plans. Hopefully we've sort of addressed that with a lot of specificity there. Basically, as Cara, as you noted, right, there a lot of it depends, right, on what you are wanting to tackle, what your organization is really able to accomplish based on where it is in its DE&I journey, or even just the information and resources it has available, to tackle it. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, I agree. Based on the time that question came in, I think we covered that one. Hopefully, in the
for sure.
So yeah, but
one question here is it ever okay to visually classify within our system? So visually mark disability, race, or gender, for example.
Yeah.
So here's my response to that, and how I have seen the context I have seen this question raised in is, say we are going through progression planning or talent planning, and we're talking about our large organization, and we somehow want an easy reference to identify a particular employee or candidate as having this particular characteristic. As a lawyer, I don't like that at all. I think it can be anything like, here's a picture of Lara, she's got a disability, she gets a green check, and she's a woman, so she gets a pink circle, and, not to make glib of it, but any sort of visual markers, as a lawyer and a litigator, those are potentially evidence. So my natural reaction to that is find another way to highlight or identify that aspect of that candidate. It does sort of hurt, just finding icons or labels just sort of trudges up a lot of not good connotations to it. So I would avoid that practice. That's my 2 cents. Cara, why don't you get
I'm not going to disagree. Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but I get this question often in a different context where it's not like we're making an employment decision, but for EEO1 reporting purposes and affirmative action planning purposes, we need to know the race and gender information of our employees.
Oh,
so in those circumstances, what the EEOC says is that self-identification is the preferred method. So you should be offering that voluntary opportunity for individuals to self-ID, but it is voluntary. So if they don't, then it is okay to do a visual observation. and record that in your systems. I think the preferred approach is to look at other employment records. I'm not sure exactly what that would be, other than something that might indicate I don't know, some organizations that they've been a part of, or photo ID. But ultimately, yeah, someone needs to make a best guess on race or gender. Now, you mentioned disability here, and I think that's a different issue, because we're not required to report on disability other than what we know as self-ID. So if you're a federal contractor, you are soliciting that information and reporting the results of that. But I've always been a little leery of telling an employer to go ahead to mark someone that hasn't chosen to self-ID as disabled, to mark them as disabled in your system. One, I think that's, it's different than race or gender. People might not consider themselves to be disabled. And it could also, going back to Laura's point on evidence, it's not just whether or not someone's disabled, but whether or not they're perceived as being disabled, that could create a violation of the law. So I on disability side, I wouldn't recommend it. Let's see what else we've got here. So if a company sets a minority hire goal and makes hiring decisions based on that goal, how do they avoid a potential reverse discrimination violation? So this goes back to Laura's point earlier. When you're making hiring decisions, selection decisions themselves, you want to avoid basing that on race or gender or any goal. I think the objective when you have a goal based on your workforce demographics is to try to make improvements without taking race or gender into account. And the main way of doing that is increasing the diversity of your applicant pool, making good faith efforts to cast a wide net, get as many diverse candidates as we can, and then you're going to apply your selection process in a neutral manner. So that we're not making hiring decisions based on having a goal or someone's race or gender. We always want to hire the most qualified person.
There was a question here about, are you aware of any direct correlations between statistics that include pay gap and promotional gap data? If yes, provide some examples. I'm not quite sure what this question is getting to. I'm not aware of anything kind of off the top of my head that has any sort of correlation between those two. I don't know, Cara, what have you seen?
Yeah, nothing comes to mind. I have to think about that one.
Yeah.
And I think we'll get a list of these questions. So if your question isn't answered, we can follow up with you.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here, well, it's two parts, two different questions. Is in-house counsel typically a good resource to help companies remain compliant with applicable laws? Yes. Now, certainly someone with employment law expertise, I would say yes, with respect to that. A lot of times organizations don't have the luxury of having an in-house counsel or an in-house counsel with that level of expertise. But yes, that would be an important job duty of that lawyer, ideally is to be able to have the expertise to kind of give that, proactive approach. But I still know a number of organizations who, even if they have a couple in-house lawyers, depending on the size, they don't have that level of expertise. So it depends, but ideally, yes, that would come from that source. Some organizations also have a pretty strong compliance department, or if they are a government contractor, they have a department that is, does those sorts of reports. And so even though they might not be lawyers themselves, they are very well versed and experienced in that area. And so are a good way to keep an organization in compliance, with that particular issue. This question also asked, if a company sets a minority hire goal and makes hiring decisions based on that goal, how do they avoid a potential reverse discrimination violation?
That's one I just answered. Yeah.
Oh, that's the one. Okay,
yeah, I did that one. Okay. I took it out of order. I like that one, so I took it out.
Yeah, no, okay, I get it. This next one on roadmap, you want to answer that one, Cara?
Yeah, are the roadmap items shown? Are the roadmap items shown examples of typical recommendations that come from audits when obvious gaps are recognized, or are there other more frequent recommendations you have seen? I think that one's a little hard to answer because, you know, every audit and every organization is different. So it's just going to depend on, you know, what you're looking at and what the results are, you know, what you want to achieve, going back to that part of it. So I don't know if I could come up with, you know, other recommendations, but I think every audit might have a life of its own. So you just need to be prepared to kind of go where it takes you. You know, again, based on the objectives that you want to achieve, you might, you know, set additional goal posts along the road for yourself.
There's a question here about the 100 contracted employees over what period of time. I think that is in reference to the California pay equity guidance. And so that would be 100 if you had 100 employees from a labor contractor in the past year, at some point in the past year, so in 2022, then you would be required to submit that information. Now, without going into too much detail of the nitty gritties, which Cara and I could both completely dig into and get really excited about.
When a whole other webinar.
Yeah, right. We should. You are looking at a snapshot period to present your data set for the basis of your report. So your report might not include all 100 of those employees, depending on what snapshot period you pick. But the way you look to see if you are required to provide that information is if you had 100 employees from a labor contractor in the past year.
Yeah. The next one, do you need to be certified by an advocacy organization to adopt certain titles? Some companies focus on D&I versus DEI. So as far as I'm aware, no. I mean, it's really just an internal choice on terminology that a company chooses to use. I think you can get certified, professionals can get certified by different organizations, kind of like SHRM does, as we have the SHRM credit here on the screen. But as far as the terminology that an organization adopts, I've heard companies use different terms or phrases when it comes to diversity as well. So you're free to adopt whatever you're comfortable with or your organization is comfortable with. And I think just like everything else, we see it change over time. Remember, it was just D&I for a while. And then within the past couple of years, it's become DE&I. I hear some DEIB for belonging. So it's going to continue to morph as we change. I can probably take the next one too. Is there a requirement to complete an AAP each year, or is that a best practice? So if you are a federal contractor, meaning you are a company that contracts with the federal government directly or indirectly as a subcontractor, and you're covered by those affirmative action laws and regulations, you're required to develop an AAP every year. So you've got to look at your workforce demographics and your employment activity on an annual basis. And starting last year, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs instituted a requirement to register and certify in the agency's portal on an annual basis that you are in compliance. So, you know, if you've got questions about that, feel free to email me and I can talk about that all day.
You probably do talk about that all day. So one here is you mentioned that sexual orientation is not usually disclosed and would need a special survey. What are other factors that can be measured in a special survey? I think we we touched on that a little bit. Any factor that you would like to measure upon. I kind of recommend exercising a little bit of caution with this, only because some of these issues are so sensitive, and some employees might have not feel, even though it's a voluntary survey, some might be affronted that the question is even asked, for it. But, sexual orientation is one. I have seen some that do ask about disability, obviously in a very respectful way. And aside from the compliance one, then the EEO forms that you fill out, are you disabled or not? That kind of form that everyone kind of fills out. Aside from that, some have thought about religion. But I think that, things that are not automatically reported are those characteristics. But I would say my sort of guidance on this is not just ask because you want to ask, but ask because it is potentially an area where you as an organization want to do something positive with that information. Right. I think some have asked the question about sexual orientation or identification because they, you might be in a state where it's kind of required, like California, you can actually report on these, the different sexual orientation or sexual identity, or, you want to see, do we need to be more cognizant in our terminology, whether we ask for pronouns, or are we making a more concerted effort to be inclusive in this space? So pick, one of those categories, protected characteristics, but that aren't already obtained through our compliance paperwork. But again, I would say only do it if you're looking to make a concerted effort and use that information to build a more inclusive sort of environment, not because we just have some generalized, we're just really interested in what all these things are. I don't know, Cara, if you want to add on that at all.
No, I mean, I completely agree with all of that. The only thing that came to mind is some of you may have seen the White House came out with a proposal to modernize the questions, the survey questions that employers and the federal government use around race. So potentially that could be changing in the future to get more granular and get more, specific information about, not just that someone's Asian, for example, but maybe, Chinese or Japanese or one of the, different national origins. So just stay tuned for that. I think that's likely to happen. It'll be interesting to see how that, rolls out and how it will affect, other requirements, especially for federal contractors when we don't have information that is that granular. So. The next one, do you encourage ERGs for specific demographics such as Hispanic, LGBTQIA, or simply an ERG that includes a random sampling of employees? Well, typically ERGs are kind of organized around either a demographic or specialty interest group. So it wouldn't be unusual to have, an ERG based on demographics or some other, relevant special interest. The random sampling, I'm not sure what that ERG would be, but the thing to also keep in mind, no matter what your ERGs are, or any employee should be eligible and entitled to participate, regardless of what the focus is. You want to make sure that it's available and open to all, but generally they are kind of geared towards people with the same interest. Here's another question back to the disability survey. So here is if the person asked for an accommodation but did not self-ID as an individual with a disability, do you recommend record alignment? I mean, that's a good question, but I would still be cautious here because, and these are all very fact specific, obviously. So this is going to depend on the circumstances, but just because someone asks for an accommodation doesn't mean they necessarily meet the definition of a disability within the meaning of the ADA or Section 503. So I would still be a little bit cautious here, but again, it would depend on, I think, the circumstances. I could also see circumstances or, you know, an event where the facts would make that as concerning. But I think the goal would be to have a consistent approach and application. So in those circumstances, I would probably still be cautious about doing that, just because a lot of employers will accommodate people for impairments that don't rise to a level of a disability. And then the last questions. So this one, I think, goes back to the California requirement, pay data requirements.
So is it, yes, 100 employees from a staffing agency at one time, or 100 over the year?
I think it's going to be in that snapshot period, right? I would have to double check.
I would have to double check on the FAQs. Yeah. I don't, it says if it's employer has 100 or more employees in and outside of California, has at least one in California, is sort of the standard for employees. So that leads me to say that it is 100 at any point, but we would need to look into that.
Yeah, so the FAQs on this just came out last week, I think it was, which finally, at least they came out since the report is due in May. So you can certainly check out their FAQs from the state agency.
Yeah, and the Civil Rights Division, for those of you who are interested, has promised to update their website with the template collection form today by the 1st. So those of you who are just like itching to fill out your spreadsheets in order to kind of get underway, you should have a template today to use to download from the site. So that's all good news.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think that's all of our questions that we have. Everyone who has stuck around, thank you very much. I don't know if we have any parting thoughts from our moderator, but from behalf of myself and Cara, thank you guys so much for sticking around.
Yes, thank you guys so much for joining today. We will now end the webinar.
Thanks so much.